All right, it's 11 o'clock. Yay! Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Malika Williams, and I am the founder of the Center for Women's Voice, where I teach women how to communicate without apologizing or overanalyzing. Welcome to our inaugural event in this Candid Conversation series, where we're going to talk about how to hold space in hard times. I'm going to introduce you to my guest, Azizi Williams. Azizi is the assistant head of Sequoia, which is a K-12 school in Pasadena. And starting in fall of 2021, she's going to be the head of the Children's Community School in Van Nuys, which is like a great, great step. So in addition to Azizi's current role at Sequoia, she is also a master facilitator of conversations around parenting, diversity, equity, and inclusion, social and emotional wellness for students, parents, administrators, and teachers. And she's also my big sister. Welcome, Azizi.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So I invited Azizi to this conversation today because I am always looking for practical tools in leadership development and in using your voice for myself and for my clients, for women at large. How do we show up in our lives, in our daily lives, in the way that we want to, and in moments like the moment we're in. I'm using the word moment loosely, but where there's a lot of dialogue and reflection and kind of swirling up of difficult ideas and topics. I think it's important to have some tools about how to enter into those conversations as a participant, but also from a leadership perspective, how we can facilitate kind of productive and connected and engaged experiences. I know that excuse me, for myself, over the past few weeks, I've had some really awkward moments and some discomfort and I would even say trauma in some moments, being on a participant in a conversation that wasn't being kind of led in a really supportive way, or in certain one-on-one interactions. So I just wanted to pick Azizi's brain about this topic, and I felt like with both of our experiences, we could generate some kind of guidelines and principles that you can use in your life moving forward from this conversation. How does that sound? Anything you want to add to that, Azizi?
No, I think that sounds great. I think, yeah, as you mentioned, I think these are skills that everyone can benefit from. Whether you're a leader or not a leader, you know, these are all things that I think are important for us to know as we try to navigate difficult conversations with each other.
Great. So I just want to start by asking you, what is holding space? It's kind of a buzz phrase these days. I don't remember hearing it 10 years ago, or it seems to have gotten traction whenever it was coined. But for you, what does that mean, holding space?
So for me, holding space really means being thoughtful and intentional, creating a moment, a time, and preparing for a difficult conversation, basically. So you know, knowing that there's going to be a difficult conversation, you can help hold space by being thoughtful, intentional, and thinking about how to do it in such a way that is taking care of everyone who's involved. So again, that comes with planning, thinking about, you know, the participants, the kind of information that needs to be delivered, and how can I make this conversation as productive as possible. And, you know, difficult conversations come up around all sorts of things. You know, maybe you're sharing some hard feedback. Maybe it's an evaluative sort of scenario. Maybe it's, you know, something didn't go well for your team or for your colleagues and you need a moment to process with everyone. Maybe it's a conversation about money. even conversations about food can be challenging depending on the context. So it's always good to think about, is this a topic, or, you know, is this something that can potentially bring up big feelings or emotions? And if it is, then how can I be intentional about the space I'm creating for that conversation? And these days, like you mentioned, a lot of people are realizing that they need to have more conversations about race and racism, diversity, equity, inclusion, and those certainly bring up lots of emotions. And so finding that people are wanting more skills and tools about how to facilitate those kinds of conversations. And while most, the best possible outcome is for you to plan for a conversation or holding space for a conversation, there are times when you suddenly find yourself in a difficult conversation. And even then you can do things, and there are strategies to hold space, even when you didn't realize you were going to be having a difficult conversation. And those are things like, listening, asking clarifying questions, and then giving yourself time to follow up later. So there are all sorts of times and moments when having the skills to hold a space are valuable.
I love that piece about giving yourself time to process and respond later if something is spontaneous when you can, because I think that's something that I experience, and I know a lot of my clients do, is feeling just put on the spot and then feeling like, oh, I have to respond, come up with some profound statement of something. And I think it's important to remember, like, usually you have a choice. You might have to really own that and, create that space for yourself, but it's up to you when you talk about whatever you want to talk about. There's, I think, very few situations where you actually have to speak in the moment about the thing.
Absolutely.
So being able to say, like, oh, I hear you, or that's a good question, let me take some time to think about it. Like, what a powerful thing. It doesn't mean you're not good on your feet. It doesn't mean that you're anything. It just means that you're taking care of yourself. And you understand the consequences or the stakes of the conversation. So I think that's a great point. Why do you feel like we should hold space? What is the opportunity? Why do this? There are a lot of ways to communicate and whatnot, but what is it specifically about holding space?
So, I believe our society is conflict avoidant, and sometimes people think by not having the difficult conversation or by avoiding it, they're being helpful or they're being kind. But I really feel like that is actually not being kind, because you're not giving people an opportunity to really grow or to understand the situation from multiple perspectives. And so, we hold space so that we can grow, so that our institutions can grow, so that, the people within our institutions can grow, so that our family members and friends can grow. And so that, I feel like that's really being kind and showing them empathy, saying, I care about you, I believe in you, and that's why I want you to know this, or that's why I want to hear from you about things that have been difficult or challenging. I feel like that's really allowing things to move forward and things to progress. And and you're helping others sort of work on those skills and practice that as well. And I really feel like, and I heard this from one of our other podcasts, that we like to listen to, that stumbling forward is better than doing nothing. So, you might feel like, what if I say something wrong, or what if I do the wrong thing? But ultimately saying, hey, I'm not perfect, but we're trying, and trying to push forward is better than doing nothing. So that's why I think it's important to hold those spaces.
Yeah. I love what you're saying just about the process, that there is something very powerful in thinking about a thing ahead of time and interpreting why you're doing it in a certain way, and that is a part of the healing or the opportunity, right? So I think one of the things that I feel in this moment, and what can happen with difficult or sensitive conversations, is that we get so wrapped up in the content of what we're saying, or of the discussion itself, that we're not taking time to think about how the discussion is happening or the situation around it. And that's really, I think that's really like what gets me is
Yeah.
when I feel like I'm in a situation where, yeah, the emphasis is on, you know, racism and institutional race, all these big things, but nobody's really thought about how we're going to engage in these issues and how people feel coming into the conversation and all of this. And it's just like the way you do things matters. And I think stumbling forward is better. So there's, you know, there's always room to improve and to grow. But I think, especially from a leadership perspective, you really have to think about how the work is happening, right? How things are being done. So, and that's probably the crux of what I wanted to talk to you about, you know?
Well, and so, you know, this is reminding me of something that I heard in a medical context called set and setting, and I found it fascinating. And, you know, research has shown that where you give a medication and how you give the medication and who's around that person, you know, when they're getting the medication can affect the quality or the outcome for the patient. And so I think about that when we're thinking about content being delivered or thinking about conversations. It's, you know, the setting and how you deliver and the tone and, you know, what's happening around can really affect the outcome and how it's received, and you know, can make it go well or not go well. So it's absolutely worth it to be intentional about how we deliver messages or how we encourage people to share.
Yes. So with that in mind,
yes,
I'd love us to just jam some guidelines, some tips, suggestions for how to have these conversations. So thinking about from a leadership perspective, if you were initiating a moment or a space, from a participant perspective, you know, just coming into a thing, into a conversation, what are there things that you can do to take care of yourself or to have a certain frame of mind? And I think, you know, your experience, you've got a huge range of experience. So you deal with families, you deal with students one-on-one, you deal with large groups. So I think in terms of those different contexts, you know, I think a lot of us have been in, or I should speak for myself, I've been in some large group contexts lately. So I'm interested in that. But I think tips kind of can go across those different contexts. But just practically, what's the first kind of keystone concept?
Well, you know, you need a plan. So the first thing is to make a plan. That's what we've been talking about. Like the benefit of holding space is having the time usually to make a plan. So the first thing to ask yourself is, what do we want here? Like, what is the purpose of this conversation? Is this a time where I just need to deliver some difficult news, and so I want to be, you know, mindful about that? Or is it a time where I want to hear the stories of others and I want people to hear from each other? Is it a time when I want feedback, or I need to hear feedback? That could potentially be difficult. Is it space to process? So think about what is it that you want to have happen, and then from there, so you know, thinking about those different kinds of difficult conversations, think about the facilitation. Who, you know, who's the facilitator who's going to really support the outcome, the best possible outcome for this conversation? Sometimes if you are the leader of the organization, or, you know, in that situation, sometimes it makes sense for you to sit in the back of the room and just listen and have somebody else do the facilitation, because that's going to be what gets the most, you know, honest, thoughtful conversation. So it's really important to think about sort of where you position yourself as the leader and how you are setting up the conversation to go well. If this is a conversation about race and racism and you are a white person, you might want to have a person of color at least partner with you or lead the facilitation so that they can have some experiences that they're able to share and speak from a, you know, I perspective about. So, you know, really who's facilitating the conversation can go a long way in the quality of the conversation. If you can, if you're able to, work with a partner. I have a partner, Emily Singer, and she's great. We work really well together, and we could divide up the work. You know, one of us could manage the chat if it's on Zoom, which it largely is these days. You know, someone can chime in. Maybe I'm not hearing something, she's got a different perspective. It's really, it's great to have a partner if you can when you're facilitating. think about the amount of time that you want to set for these conversations.
Yes.
So I have found in my experience that like 45 minutes to an hour is the most time that
Mm,
people can sit with a difficult, conversation, or just, on Zoom in general. And so
yeah.
if you think that it might take more time, or maybe there's a lot, many voices that you want to hear, consider breaking it up into multiple chunks with some space in between. I feel like that's really a kind thing to do for people so that they can take care of their needs and not feel stuck
Yeah.
in a situation. And then, I will say, think about the size of the group.
Hmm.
And is this going to be a conversation? Do you want to create a sense of intimacy? If so, in this Zoom world, that means holding the number of participants to those who could fit on one screen so that you
Yeah.
can see everybody,
Yeah.
maybe then you can actually have a conversation. But if you're talking, 200, 300 people, sometimes that's what's required. Be clear that it's not a conversation, but
Right.
this is a moment to just hear from people, and just keep that in mind as you're setting, as you're, making your plan.
Yeah. Oh, so good. So good. I love
Yeah.
what you're saying
Mhm.
about planning the intention for the gathering, right? And having maybe one objective of what is the purpose. Because I think sometimes when that's not clear, there's a lot of people think that there's um a lot of things could happen from this conversation. We can give people a platform, we can to share what's going on, we can brainstorm, we can come up with solutions. And that's just not
Mm,
realistic. I think
right.
it's hard. And if you're really planning things out ahead of time, you can kind of come to that conclusion like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, those not only is that might not be realistic for the time frame, but in terms of the modes of thinking and being, like, those require very different skill sets, right? Or different postures, right? Of
Hmm.
hearing
Hmm.
people share about their experiences and then like brainstorming. Those are totally
Two
different
different
things,
meanings.
two different meanings,
Yeah.
right? So
And I think
making,
that the thing that's
yeah,
happening right now is like there's this sense of urgency, which is great, and people want things to change right now.
yeah,
But you need to give it the time, and you sort of lay out a plan that's gonna take time to get to where you want to get. It's not gonna
yeah,
happen in a day. It's not gonna happen in a meeting. And sometimes people can get impatient with that, but it's better to have a long view, and to demonstrate and project and to let people know that you're in it for the long view and for the long haul than to try to accomplish everything in one meeting.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
I think piggybacking on that concept of the planning is to
Mm,
communicate in advance what the plan is to the people
yes.
involved. So I think it's good and well to go through those thoughts and what the purpose is and the time frame and all that, but it's really not following through unless you communicate that to everyone who's going to be there. So the key pieces of information, the time frame, the purpose, who's going to be participating. I think sometimes as leaders, once we figure things out, we feel like, great, I'm good to go. But there is
Mm,
a really kind of an act of sharing that information that is very, very useful. And I think often people say, well, some things just go without saying. I believe if anything can go without saying, it's worth being said. Why not?
mhm,
Just say it. As
mhm.
a participant, I really value knowing those types of things, knowing how long I'm going to be in this container, what the purpose of it is, who's involved, that kind of thing. And I think if those things are not communicated in advance, then as a participant, you should ask those questions. Like, those are really good things to know, in order for you to feel like it's worth giving your time to. Um,
Mhm.
so just, yeah, there are moments in the past couple months, or this, however long this has been, the past month, where I have been inside of a conversation and really wish I knew some of these questions and did not
Mm,
did not advocate for myself by asking that.
mhm,
Now it's something I know to do in advance, but I think
mm.
it's important to let people know what they're entering into.
Again, that's a way to have empathy for those people. Their time is
Yeah,
important. Their time is valuable, and you want to signal that as the facilitator, as a leader, as the person holding the space, that you respect that. you know,
Yeah.
and you respect their time. Yeah. So, so then there's the planning that's happened in the facilitation, and then there's the actual facilitation. So how you begin to facilitate is really important. There's some key things that you can do to help set the tone so that you get, you know, the best possible outcome, so that you create a space that feels comfortable, and where people are willing to share. And it's nice to have kind of a transition activity or moment, or something that helps people transition from whatever busy thing that they just did to like being present in the moment for this conversation now. And what my colleague and I like to read this poem to help with that transition, but also to signal kind of what we're doing here together and the kind of space that we want to create. And so I'm going to read it. And it's called An Invitation to a Brave Space by Mickey Scott Bay Jones. So it goes like this. Together we will create brave space, because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars, and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. So that's a poem that we use in particular when we're facilitating spaces about race and racism, diversity, equity, inclusion, because again, we have to acknowledge that we're not perfect. You know, it might be, it might feel safe to some and not to others. So we can't promise safety, but we can encourage people to be brave and to be creative, and to do the best that they can. And so that's used to help transition and sort of set the tone. In addition to that, reiterate why we were all here.
Yeah.
We talked about the norms. You know, we have a set of norms that we tend to use, but we also ask the participants, you know, are there norms that we have left off? Are there other things that we can do to help, you know, help the space be as comfortable as possible? And when we're talking about the norms, I also say things like, hey, as a facilitator, this is a large group. I want everyone's voice to be heard. I'm going to limit your time. You know, if you could please limit your time to maybe a minute, or, you know, I try to set the parameters for how long the sharing could go for. And then I also say there may be a time when I have to sort of cut you off just so that all the voices can be heard, or so that we can all be able to share. So that's important to do with the norms. It's also important to talk about confidentiality. I mean, to think about it ahead of time. Is this really a space that can be confidential? Maybe it's not, in which case you shouldn't promise that. But if it's a really small, intimate space, you could say things like, please don't share the stories that aren't yours outside of this space. You could also things like just say, you can share themes, but maybe, you know, specific stories or you know, from specific people, but think about confidentiality and how that plays in or doesn't play in. I like to share that I like to say to people that there are going to be awkward pauses, you know, and that's okay. There's going to be moments of silence. We're going to be staring at each other at some point. And that's okay. And that kind of helps ease the tension also ahead of time. So, those are some thoughts related to just setting it up well. And the last thing that I do, you know, often when I start a facilitation, I start by sharing a little bit about myself, about how I'm feeling in the moment, as a way to model that it's okay to have big feelings, that it's okay to not know how you feel. So I kind of share my personal experience. So I think demonstrating some vulnerability as a facilitator can go a long way in helping other people feel comfortable to do that as well. So those are some of my suggestions for starting off a facilitation.
Okay. Speaking of facilitation, I just want to acknowledge some of the comments that are coming in. We will share the poem so that people can use that as a resource. And we will be doing Q&A at the end. So save your questions. We'll have some space. I saw one from Clara, my mother, earlier. We'll get to those questions. So she's on. She made it. All right. So setting the tone as a facilitator, I think another thing to take care of yourself when you are facilitating or when you're participating is to really think about your own physical needs. So like really base level practical, like go to the bathroom before the thing happens, right? Like we kind of forget about those
Go to the
things,
bathroom.
but it's so just, you don't want to be distracted, right? So going to the bathroom, making sure you're not hungry coming into the situation, making sure you have some water nearby. It's really important to think about your body, even though we're not necessarily in rooms with people right now. You're still a body, you're still a presence, and kind of whatever's going on physiologically is going to impact your capacity for empathy and listening and all of those things. So really, really not taking any of that for granted. I think also deciding for yourself what you want to get out of this experience. So there's the kind of bigger level purpose of the conversation, but making a decision personally, like me as a leader, as a facilitator, or as a participant, as a member of this group, what is at stake for me in this conversation? Like, what is it? Why am I here? Is it, why am I here? And what is it that I want to kind of, what am I curious about? What am I wanting to expand? I love that line in the poem about examining what we think we know. You know, I think that is so for everybody, for everybody. I think
Yes.
with these conversations, there's a lot of times where I'm like, I'm a Black person. I know. Okay. I don't have to do the same work that you have to do coming into this. And that's just not true. It's different work. No. It's a different perspective, but I still have a lot of assumptions. And if anything, some of these conversations have made me recognize like, wow, even in our own family, right? A family, nuclear family of Black people, we're all having very different experiences and reactions, right? So I can't make any assumptions about anybody that's outside of my own person. So I think just entering into those conversations with an intention. So not just showing up to see what happens. You know, you could, but I think it's useful to to decide, oh, I'm curious about X, or I want to be open to listening and understanding and humanity, or I want to really, as a facilitator, connect to my intuition in this time, you know, just kind of having a objective for yourself. And I think in terms of, particularly from a leadership perspective, knowing yourself and what might trigger you, you know, in your own experience, knowing your own assumptions or areas of shame or pain that somebody else might walk into unknowingly that could take you out of the situation. Like, it's great to know those things in advance and to know what your physical tells are when you're under stress, you know, so that you can mitigate those and kind of neutralize them or interpret them if they're happening in real time, so that it's not a distraction from the container that you're supporting. So if there are things, you know, that happen, you tense up, you know, really having some tools to like, okay, this is how I know I can relax when I do this, or just really supporting yourself physically and emotionally in that space.
Yes. And something you said that reminded me of a concept from Brene Brown, who I love, and you know, like it's one of my gurus who I follow, and we all love her. So I just read her Dare to Lead book, and one of the concepts that she talks about is being a learner, not a knower. Right. So like in life and in this world, you can be someone who just knows everything, or you can be someone who's always open to learning. And it's better to be a learner than to be a knower. And I think about that, you know, as I go through life, like I should always be ready to open to, I didn't know that, or this is new, or, you know, so try to be a learner, even in your facilitation. Right. And I so appreciate the mindfulness that you are talking about, like being mindful of who you are and how you show up and how you can manage your feelings and expectations so that you can, you know, serve and facilitate others. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about there's that inner work that Malika just described, but so then your outward facing facilitation, like what does it actually look like? Some things to actually consider as you're facilitating a conversation and hold space. And you know, one of the hardest things about facilitating is anticipating a bomb being dropped, you know, like anticipating that someone's going to come in and just say something that's going to just, you know, shock and, you know, just like derail the whole thing, right? And that happens, and you can't control it. You know, people
Yeah.
are unpredictable. You have no idea, you know, even with your best laid plans, what someone's going to say, or you know, what's going to motivate them. And so in those moments, you know, it's good to just like breathe and
Yeah.
then and try to redirect, because what you don't want is for someone to hijack the space for everyone else, you know.
Yes.
So when I'm facilitating, I'm really thinking about how is this space being made a space that everyone can feel comfortable sharing, or you know, even if what they're sharing is uncomfortable, but just making sure that not one person is dominating that that space and the time, because the time is limited, as we said before. So I try to say things like, I hear you. That sounds like that was a really difficult situation that happened. I'd love to process with you afterwards. Let's talk more about this. Can I have your permission to move on so that other people can have an opportunity to share? You know, so think ahead of time about how you're going to manage those people or that person. Sometimes I take that as an opportunity to share a personal story that can help move things forward. Like I remember when something like that happened to me, or you know, when I was in a similar situation, this is how you know, I got through it, or things like this sometimes happen. But again, you want to try to get things back on track in terms of allowing others to also be able to share. So that's how you deal with sort of someone who's kind of dominating or manipulating the time.
Yeah.
It's good to make personal connections with people. So, you know, eye contact, repeating back what they're saying, connecting what they're saying to themes from what other people were saying. So do all that you can to signal that you are listening and that that they're being heard. And that helps people, again, feel comfortable, and it helps them be willing to be vulnerable if they feel like there is at least one person, you know, on the other side or across from them who's hearing them, hearing their story, even if it is painful or hard. So those are some things to consider when you're in the moment, and when you're facilitating. So then you need to also think about, you know, wrapping up. And sometimes, you know, so it's good, and again, to have maybe a timekeeper for yourself. You need to keep track of the time, and to let people know when it's getting close. Like, okay, we have for a few more, you know, maybe one more person. Then you want to then thank everyone, and you know, and wrap it up, really, again, being respectful of people's time. It's good to look out for moments where you could open an invitation to people who haven't spoken. There are some people who kind of need an invitation, or are not willing to kind of jump in. And so if at some different points throughout the facilitation you say, okay, I'd like to make this time available, or I'd like to create the space for people who haven't yet shared their voice, that's good facilitation. And then, you know, thanking people at the end. So make sure to thank them for the courage that it took to show up and to share, and then let them know what's going to happen next. So those are my thoughts about kind of wrapping it up and ending the facilitation.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Azizi, if you could share about some different kind of frameworks or structures for holding space that you're aware of. I know you've been in a lot of different contexts. So what are different options?
So I'm sure there are many, there are many different options, and there's lots of, you know, protocols out there. So I'll say that. So it might be worth it depending on, you know, the context. If it's a workplace situation, sometimes we rely on protocols which have very structured ways of sharing and listening. And, you know, protocols are sort of rules that help to make sure that everyone's voice is considered. So I'm definitely a fan of protocols, and I think there's a time and place for them. There's also affinity work. So sometimes it's helpful to give people a space to share and process with people who share their identity. And this is particularly useful for those who tend to be in the minority in their workplace or in their school setting or in the world. It's as a leader, I think you should look out for those opportunities where you can help to create a space for affinity work to happen. And in particular, related to, issues of race and racism, sometimes people need to just talk with people who look like them or who have a similar shared experience, to just help understand and manage and have some share strategies, and support, so that they can show up better for those other conversations that happen where everyone's together. So I'm a huge fan of affinity work, and I encourage it. And at my school, we have several different kinds, and it's been great. And really, affinity is it's about equity, and it's about giving everyone the space that they need to be their best selves. Not everybody needs that space. It's not like everybody needs the same thing. People need different things to be successful. And so affinity is allowing that and acknowledging that equity. Another kind of facilitation that I'm a fan of is counsel. And I've had different kinds of counsel training, and counsel is a protocol where it's really about continuing the tradition of storytelling and getting to know a community. So in counsel, the talking piece, there's a prompt, and you're encouraging people to speak from the heart and to listen from the heart. And the facilitator gets to think about what kind of prompt is going to be best in that moment and with that group to get the kinds of stories that would be helpful for the group. And there's something really comforting and really special about just hearing the stories of others. And you can learn so much and grow as a community when you have opportunities to sit in counsel. So that's another type of facilitation, but it's very specific and is not the kind for feedback. It's a specific time and place that's appropriate for counsel versus some of these other kinds of facilitation that we've been talking about.
And when you said talking piece, do you mean a physical object?
There's a physical object, exactly. So
okay.
the talking piece is really important. Like, for example, if this is my fan, but this could be a talking piece. You only talk if you have the talking piece.
Got it.
Because in our culture, we can interrupt each other, and we can cut people off. And so when there's a talking piece, we have to practice restraint, and we have to practice listening. And waiting for our turn. And that can be really powerful because, some people are really comfortable interrupting and jumping in, and some people are really uncomfortable with that. And so it's an equalizer to give everyone the same amount of time to share. So again, it's not for every situation, but it's good to have a regular counsel practice, because it can also help in challenging situations to just have a moment where you're hearing the stories of others.
Yeah, I think I want to ask a follow-up about the affinity work piece, because I think especially now around race, I feel like there might be some resistance to a group of white people gathering to talk about racism together internally, or just not knowing, groups that are in more of the majority culture not having that experience of being together with their majority to discuss that. Can you speak to how to navigate that, or even thinking about that?
Yeah, and I froze for a little bit there, so I think I heard what you were asking. And so the affinity work. So right, so you have affinity for people when we're talking about the issues of race. Obviously, there are all kinds of affinity that we can be a part of, and I'm a part of a group and led a women in leadership affinity, right? And so that's a space where women get together, and that's a kind of affinity also. When we're talking about race, it's important to have affinity because people are in different places of their awareness and understanding of the history of equity and inclusion in America and the history of racism in America. And it can be really deflating for someone who's been immersed in, or has been the recipient of racism, or who, who understands the injustices that happen, and they've known that their whole lives, it can be deflating for them to be in a conversation with someone who's just now understanding or beginning to understand. And so again, so creating these different spaces allows people to sort of get what they need at the level with which they're at. So for white people, having a white anti-racist space can be really important. It's a space that's designated for them to come together to think about, how can we be anti-racist? How can we acknowledge that our whiteness means something in our society, that there's privilege that comes with it? And how can we work towards creating a more anti-racist space for everyone? And so those spaces are also important. So I think everyone has work that they can do in Affinity related to race, and that it can be really it can be very supportive, and it can contribute to a more harmonious and productive, workplace, or, church or school sort of organization overall.
Yeah. I think that's so insightful and speaks to the point earlier about the purpose of a specific conversation, that every conversation isn't going to meet every need for every person. So really delineating kind of the hope for a given context, and knowing that having these conversations, they're very complex issues that have different stages of processing for different people. And that there are different modes and spaces to really address those things. But there's no one size fits all. It's not going to happen in one talk. It's really opening yourself up to different ways of having these conversations. So that's great. I think I'd love to open it up for some questions if you have for Azizi or for myself. I'll kick it off with the one that I wrote down I saw earlier, which was kind of in Zoom facilitating. What is your practice for moderating the chat? How do you navigate that?
Yeah. So first of all, this is all new, right? So it's not like I don't have years and years of experience facilitating on Zoom, but I do have some experience facilitating on Zoom. And again, the times when I have facilitated, I have enlisted a partner, and that partner monitors the chat and raises the questions that come up from the chat. So we have found that to keep the chat on. Right. So there's, first of all, do you just turn off the chat, or do you have it on, and I think, sort of the larger the group gets, the more important it is, that chat feature. So you can use the chat to have people sort of introduce themselves first, because you can't go around in a circle and everybody introduce themselves on Zoom. So you can ask people, okay, introduce yourself, say, who you are, where you work, whatever, so that people can just sort of see who's in the room. Also, for people who maybe don't want to speak up, maybe that people, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Maybe people don't want to raise their blue hand, we say. Like some people might not want the spotlight on them. So you could, having that alternative place where you can also put your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them, is helpful. And then sometimes in the chat, themes can come up, and so the facilitator can say, I'm noticing these themes and I want to raise that. And then, there's this business of saving the chat. I haven't found success with that. Maybe other people have. So I don't think it's a place to keep notes about what happened in the conversation. I think you still need someone dedicated to taking notes, if that's the purpose of that conversation, and if you want to follow up. I think the chat should just be, it should go away when the meeting is over, and that's the end of it. That's personally how I have used the chat.
Okay. Insightful. What I gleaned from that is just like, you got to practice. If you have a facilitator, you got to practice, and also you gain skills as you go, right? Just being able to coordinate with another person, that back and forth of one person giving focus to whoever's talking and one person monitoring the chat, and then you guys, the interplay is really skillful, Yeah,
and it didn't take us long to come up with that. So I also want to say this whole stumbling forward thing, you try it out and just be explicit with the group, like, hey, we're trying some things out. I think that's the best you can do.
Right. Are there any other questions from the people who are watching? We'll have a few minutes or comments. I'll read out loud. Katie said, some people need help with speaking up, and that starts with the facilitators to create that space. Yeah, I think we can take for granted just, and this is why I like that poem in the beginning, but how much work it takes to just speak forward, period, right? Or just to speak out. And especially in a group context, that for many people, that's not their natural mode. And so to even be in a situation where that might be expected of them is a huge undertaking, right? So being aware of that as a leader.
Yeah, and Malika, I want to point out also that I have learned that you need to, if you really want to solicit feedback, you should have multiple ways with which you're doing that. And it shouldn't just be the conversation. There should be an opportunity for a survey or, you know, an invitation to email me later, or, you know, some people process through writing. And so it's good to have multiple ways to solicit feedback and not just the group.
Yeah, that's a good point. Robert says, would you recommend utilizing affinity work in the form of breakouts during a larger group meeting? Or maybe that really depends on the intention of the meeting.
Yeah, so you can. So I'm a part of a board, Southern California People in Independent Schools, and it's about creating spaces for DEI work in the independent school setting. And they just hosted a call to action where they did have affinity breakout rooms. And so with that, what you have to do, because it's people opt into the room that they want to be in, and it's also important in those moments to have a space that's not affinitized, so that everyone is not forced to do it if they don't want to. So offer a non-affinitized space, and that maybe that's the main room, and then ask people to, you know, ask people to change their names or to add 1, 2, or 3, depending, you know, like, so name the breakout rooms by the type of affinity, and then have people change their names so that you can sort them into the breakout rooms, because managing breakout rooms is, you know, that's bananas, and that takes time. And so you want to try to do that at the top, and then, you know, have some other discussion while the person managing the breakout room can see where people want to go and sort them. But it is possible to use breakout rooms that way, as long, again, as I said, as long as you have a space that's non-affinitized also.
Okay. Trillian, I think that's Lillian. I won't say the names. We have another question. It was touched on briefly, but if you're in a space where one person is taking up a lot of airtime, what are ways that you gently redirect to draw others back in?
Yeah, that's some of the hardest, those are the hardest situations. Inevitably, there's someone who's either their story just goes on forever, or they keep, you know, kind of coming back. And I have found that, you know, first of all, if there are other people whose hands are raised, you know, in a Zoom context, you don't call on them, right? So just try not to always call on them. Cut someone off sort of gently and say, "This is what I'm hearing you say." You know, sometimes I think people go on because they worry that they haven't made their point, and so by sort of interrupting kindly and repeating back what I've heard them say, sometimes that helps them feel acknowledged and like, oh, okay, I did make my point. To stop talking, sometimes I'll gently interrupt, redirect, and present another prompt or another question. Like, is there anybody else who could speak to that? So there's ways to kind of gently, like Jedi mind trick, redirect the conversation. And you know, it just requires sometimes interrupting or kind of butting in, but in a kind way, and a way that acknowledges you've heard what they are saying and the point that they're making, the themes that they're making. And also now I want to open it up to other people. Yeah.
So I have to interrupt. I have a timer that's saying I have 1.5 minutes left, which is maybe a thing with Instagram Live that I wasn't aware of, that there's an hour time limit. So I'm not sure how to handle that. I apologize. I should have looked into that ahead of time. There are still some more questions. So I think what I'll do is just capture these, and maybe if you're open to it, Azizi, we can write some bullet point responses. I want people to get their stuff out. So I'll respond to these questions on my page, but we've got just a few. Yeah, maybe we'll have another conversation, a follow-up on this. If you have other questions that you're just thinking of now, please, you can direct message me at Center for Women's Voice. You can email me, malika@centerforwomensvoice.com. We'd love to keep this conversation going. It's clear that there's a lot of interest, and it's just important to ask these very practical questions. If you're interested in reaching Azizi, you can reach me and I will get in touch with her. If you'd like to engage her for her services or find out more about what she's doing, you can talk to me.